Last year, we were quite invested in debating whether it's Chinese New Year or Lunar New Year, and that conversation matters. But this year, let's look at the Chinese calendar from a different angle. Not the name, the time. Because in just over a century, Singapore has reset its official clock several times. That matters, especially if you're the kind who walked past the mall booths to check out your Chinese New Year annual prediction, which supposedly is based on your metaphysics data. And that time zone history might mean that you, your parents, or your grandparents' Bazi hours were calculated based on the wrong clock. Most of us assume that Singapore has always been on the same time zone. Not true. In fact, in the last 100 plus years, we've changed our time zones at least 5 to 6 times. Originally, it was local mean time, which was about plus 6:55. And then we changed to 7, 7:20, 7:30. And during Japanese occupation to align with Japan, we changed to plus 9. And then we changed back to Malayan time after the occupation. In 1982, we switched to the current time, which is GMT plus 8. As someone was born in 1950 or 1995, they were born under different time zone, different official clock. Same country, different civil time. But here's the part I love. Even today, our clock doesn't quite match the sun. If you put a proper sundial in Singapore, you realize the shortest shadow on the sundial doesn't happen at 12 noon. Usually it happens around 1 p.m. plus minus 10-15 minutes depending on the season, because our longitude corresponds to roughly GMT 6:55 mean solar time, which was what we used initially, right? But we run on UTC plus 8 for economic purposes. So when your phone says 12, the sun says, not on my watch. And Bazi was never designed around political clocks. Traditional Chinese keeping was based on solar observation. Each 时辰 spans 2 hours. So if your birth time sits on that boundary of the gap between like the solar time and the civil time, it can shift hour pillar and maybe even day pillar depending on when you are born. For most people, nothing dramatic changes. But for those people, especially those born near the transition, it absolutely can. So your day, even your hour can change. That's like 2 out of 4. And here's where it gets interesting. In many traditional Bazi system, the day doesn't change like what we do today, like 12 midnight. It changes at the start of the 子时, which corresponds to animal rat, around 11 p.m., which means quite literally the Chinese calendar can turn at the 11th hour. So if the solar correction moves your birth time across the 11 p.m. boundary, which means that if you're born in 12:05, your day pillar can flip. That's not superstition, that's astronomy. I know some of you might say, oh, I use a Bazi app that tracks your longitude and, take into account your location. That's great. But most calendar assumes that the time that you've entered is your actual location time in today's context. And they don't take into account all the historical changes. So for Singapore, before 1982, it was not UTC plus 8. But the system or the app will assume that it's a UTC plus 8 entry from a Singapore location. It's starting from the wrong civil baseline. So it's assuming that all this time that you gave belong to the UTC plus 8 time zone and correcting accordingly to that. And some apps don't even take into consideration the longitudinal difference at all. So two people entering the same data into different systems can generate very different 时辰 or Chinese hour outcomes. That's not mysticism. That's input logic and computing limitations. Bazi is astronomy in traditional dress, and astronomy does not adjust itself to economic alignment. If there's an interest, we can talk about China next, because that's an interesting topic where China, over such a vast longitudinal span, uses one time zone, but it was not the case historically. So, wish you a happy Chinese New Year!